November 1943. The Sangro River in eastern Italy. In the cold and the rain, at the foot of a line of hills, the German army has spent weeks turning into a fortress. The river here should not be much of an obstacle. In dry weather, the Sangro is a shallow, braided thing, gravel and glinting channels that a man could wade in most places. But it has been raining for 11 days. The Sangro has risen into a fast brown flood, 4 feet deep and climbing, tearing along between banks of mud that pull the boots off your feet. And on the high ground on the far side sits the German winter line, dug in, waiting, with clear observation and clear fields of fire over every yard of the crossing. The German engineers have already done the one thing that guarantees a river stays a barrier. They have destroyed the bridge. The old stone road bridge that once carried the highway over the Sangro is gone. They dropped 19 of its spans into the water and left the shattered stone piers standing in the current like a row of broken teeth. And here is the calculation that every trained engineer on both sides would have made, looking at that flooded gap in the winter of 1943. To put a bridge back across a gap that wide, strong enough to carry a 30-ton tank, is not a job of hours. It is a job of days, more likely weeks. It needs pile drivers and cranes and heavy timber. It needs concrete and daylight and time. And it needs all of that done under the guns on the hill, which is to say that, by every rule the profession knew, it could not be done at all. And yet, within the fighting for the Sangro, British engineers put a Bailey Bridge across that river, more than 1,000 feet of it, launched out over the flood on the enemy's own ruined piers, and the tanks crossed, and the winter line was turned. Not in weeks, in the time it takes to fight a battle. That pattern, a heavy bridge appearing across an impossible gap in a fraction of the time the rules allowed, repeated itself again and again, from the mountains of Sicily to the banks of the Rhine. British and Canadian and American engineers threw tank bridges across rivers in hours, sometimes in darkness, sometimes under fire, using a kind of bridge the German army had no true equal to, and never managed to copy. And that last fact is the strange one, the one worth stopping on. Germany produced some of the finest military engineering of the century. Why could it not match a bridge? Pause on that, because this is not really a story about a bridge. It is a story about two ways of thinking, and about which one wins a war. It is a story about a quiet civil servant from Yorkshire who was told his idea was not wanted, and who kept it, waiting, for 5 years. It is a story about a country that made room, just barely, for the awkward outsider with the better idea, set against a country that could not. This is the story of the Bailey Bridge. To understand why the German army, for all its skill, could not simply build the same thing, you first have to understand what military engineers on every side believed a bridge was. And to understand that, you have to go back before the war, to the slow, cautious world of army bridging in the 1920s and 1930s. For most of military history, an army that came to a river it could not wade had a small menu of unhappy choices. It could look for a ford. It could try to seize a standing bridge before the enemy destroyed it, which was mostly a matter of luck. Or it could build. And building, in the age before Bailey, meant one of two things. It meant a pontoon bridge, a roadway floated on boats or on rafts, which was quick but fragile and could carry only light loads. Or it meant a fixed bridge, raised from the riverbed on piles and trestles, which was strong but agonizingly slow, and which demanded heavy equipment that no army could carry very far or very fast. Think about what that choice really meant for a general. It meant that a river was not just a line on a map. It was a decision point, and often a graveyard for momentum. If you needed to move quickly, you took the pontoon bridge and accepted that your heaviest weapons, your tanks and your big guns, would have to wait or find another way. If you needed strength, you accepted delay. And delay in war is the most expensive thing there is. Every hour spent building a bridge was an hour the enemy spent digging in on the far side, bringing up reserves, ranging his artillery on the exact spot where your bridge would have to land. The bridge builder was working against a clock the enemy controlled, and there was no way, inside the old thinking, to have both strength and speed at once. You picked one, and you paid for the other. The British Army between the wars had thought hard about this problem. It was not careless about engineering. Its bridging was designed at a small, specialised establishment on the south coast of England, at Christchurch, where the War Office ran what was called the Experimental Bridging Establishment. The men there were serious. They produced a family of military bridges that were, for their day, perfectly respectable. There was the Inglis Bridge, a tubular steel design descended from the First World War, named for its inventor, the Cambridge professor Charles Inglis. There was the small box girder bridge and the large box girder bridge, developed from the work of an ingenious officer named Giffard Martel. These were real bridges. They worked. Armies trained on them and trusted them. It is worth lingering on that establishment at Christchurch, because it is easy to imagine it as some grand national laboratory, and it was nothing of the sort. It was small. It was underfunded. In the lean years between the wars, when defence budgets were cut to the bone, an experimental bridging unit was exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous outfit that a treasury looks at and wonders whether it can trim. There is a story, still repeated around Christchurch, that the very need for a designer like Bailey was once questioned in a budget note that asked whether the man was really necessary. Whether or not that exact phrase was ever written, it captures the mood of the place. This was not a lavish centre of innovation. It was a handful of dedicated men doing careful work with modest means, largely ignored by the wider world, right up to the moment the war made bridging a matter of national survival. And the bridges those men had produced were good ones, judged by the standards of their day. The Inglis Bridge in particular had long and honourable service, a clever tubular structure assembled from standard members. It had carried the army through one war and into the next. There was no crisis of competence at Christchurch. There was, instead, a crisis that no amount of competence inside the old framework could solve, because the framework itself was quietly going out of date. The bridges had been built inside a set of assumptions, and the assumptions were about to break. The first was about weight. The bridges of the 1920s and early 1930s were designed in a world where a heavy tank weighed perhaps 12 or 16 tons. The engineers built for that world with a sensible margin and were satisfied. Their bridges could carry the tanks of their day across a modest gap, and for years that was enough. The problem was that tanks refused to stay the same size. Through the 1930s and into the war, armoured vehicles grew heavier with every design. By the time the fighting was serious, the British were fielding tanks that weighed close to 40 tons. The infantry tank, called the Churchill, was a giant compared to anything the older bridges had been built for. And here the existing designs hit a wall that no careful engineering could talk its way around. The British box girder and tubular bridges simply could not be pushed much past 26 tons of capacity. A 40-ton tank on a 26-ton bridge is not a difficult engineering problem. It is a bridge at the bottom of the river. The second assumption was about speed and equipment. The older fixed bridges were not built to go up in a hurry. They needed cranes to lift heavy sections into place. Some needed specialized launching gear. They needed trained detachments working in reasonable conditions. In peacetime exercises, with the sun out and nobody shooting, this was tolerable. In a fast-moving war, against an enemy who blew every bridge as he retreated, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. An army that could only move as fast as its slowest bridge was an army that would be caught, again and again, stopped at the near bank of every river in Europe, while the enemy slipped away. The German army had wrestled with the same problem and arrived at a different, but equally fixed answer. German military bridging was among the most professional in the world, and it leaned heavily on pontoons and on improvisation. Their standard combat bridge, known in their cataloguing system as Bridging Equipment B, was a pontoon and trestle system, excellent in its way, but limited in what it could carry, and dependent on the water. For heavier work, they had a small number of specialized sets, including a heavy bridge they had taken over from Czechoslovakia. Their doctrine, written into their own manuals, put its faith in throwing up improvised bridges as early as possible in a river crossing, using whatever the engineers could assemble on the spot. It was a doctrine of skilled men solving each river as a fresh problem. And here is the thing that matters most about the German approach, the thing at the very centre of this story. The German system was brilliant, and it was hierarchical. It was issued from the top down. Equipment was catalogued, coded, and allotted to units by echelon according to a plan. The German engineer in the field was a highly trained professional executing a doctrine that had been handed to him. What that system was superb at was doing a known thing well. What it was not built to do was to absorb a strange new idea, arriving from an unexpected direction, and turn it in a matter of months into the standard equipment of an entire army. That distinction is the whole story. Hold on to it. So this was the settled world of military bridging as the war began. Everyone knew what a bridge was. Everyone knew it was either quick and weak or strong and slow. Everyone knew that heavy bridges needed cranes and time. Everyone knew that a river was a place where an army stopped and waited. The doctrine was complete. It was consistent. Given everything the engineers knew, it was entirely reasonable. And it was about to be made to look ancient by a man who did not fit into any of it. 47 miles from London, at the establishment in Christchurch, there worked a civilian engineer named Donald Coleman Bailey. He was not a soldier. He held no military rank. He was a civil servant, one of the quiet, salaried technical men the War Office employed to design its equipment, and for most of his career, almost nobody outside his own field had heard his name. He had come a long way, quietly, to get there. He was born in the town of Rotherham in Yorkshire, in the north of England, on September 15, 1901, the only child of a commercial cashier. He was a boy who liked to build model bridges, which in most children is a passing enthusiasm, and in Donald Bailey turned out to be the shape of an entire life. He was schooled in the north and then at a school in Cambridge, and he took a degree in civil engineering at the University of Sheffield. He worked for a firm in York, then for a railway, then for the City Engineers Department in Sheffield, ordinary jobs for a capable young engineer. And in 1928 he joined the War Office as a designer at the experimental bridging establishment, and there he stayed. The people who knew him described a man of quiet, unassuming manner. He was not loud. He was not a self-promoter. Behind the modest exterior, those who worked with him said, there was great determination and an unusual gift for invention. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man a large organization tends to overlook, right up until the moment it desperately needs him. Here is the detail that tells you everything about how systems handle men like Bailey. Around 1936, years before the war, Bailey had already worked out the essential scheme of a new kind of bridge. He took the idea to the authorities of the day, and it did not find any great favor, because the War Office had already settled on a different design. So the idea was set aside. For 5 years, one of the most consequential engineering concepts of the entire war sat unwanted, because the system already had an answer it preferred, and a preferred answer is the hardest thing in the world to argue a good idea past. What jolted the idea back to life was failure. As the war began, and the weakness of the existing bridges became impossible to ignore, the engineers at Christchurch were struggling with an unsatisfactory new version of the Old English design. The trials were going badly, and in the account Bailey himself gave in later years, it was on a car journey back from those troubled trials that he sketched his design out again, roughly, on the back of an envelope. It is an origin story that sounds almost too neat, and it is fair to say that the finer detail comes down to us largely in Bailey's own telling, but the essential shape of it is well recorded. The idea was old in his head. It had been waiting since 1936. The war simply supplied the pressure that finally forced the door open. Bailey described the sequence plainly in later life. He said he had the bare bones of the idea at the beginning of the war, and that after the fall of France the plans were at once put in hand. And then he gave the date that turned a private idea into a national project. He said that on February 14, 1941, a letter came from London ordering a full trial of a completed bridge by May. Think about what that letter was asking. It was February. They wanted a working, full-scale, tank-carrying military bridge of a completely new design, ready to demonstrate, in under 3 months. In the slow world of pre-war engineering, that timescale was almost insulting. A new bridge would normally mean years of committee work, testing, revision, and cautious approval. To ask for one in a single season was to ask for the impossible, by every standard the profession had grown up with. But this was no longer that world. France had fallen. Britain stood alone and expected to be invaded. The luxury of caution had evaporated, and into that gap of desperate urgency, an idea that had waited quietly for 5 years suddenly found the door thrown open. Sometimes a good idea does not need to be better in order to win. It needs the world around it to become frightened enough to listen. And Bailey's design had something hidden inside it that made such speed possible, something that was not really about steel at all, but about a way of thinking. The genius of the Bailey Bridge was that it was not really a bridge, it was a kit. It was a system of standard, identical, interchangeable parts that a body of men could carry by hand and assemble into a bridge of almost any length and almost any strength they needed, without cranes, without special tools, and without a single measurement taken on the spot. At the heart of it was the panel. Bailey's bridge was built from welded steel panels, each one a rectangle of latticework about 10 feet long and about 5 feet high. Each panel weighed around 570 pounds. That figure was not an accident. It was chosen so that 6 men could lift and carry one panel between them. No crane, 6 soldiers and a steel frame they could pick up and walk into position. The panels joined to one another with steel pins, driven through matching holes at the corners. That was the whole secret of the connection. Not bolts that had to be threaded and torqued in the dark. Not welding under fire. Pins, hammered through aligned holes, quick to drive and quick to knock out. Every panel was identical to every other. Every pin was identical to every other. A part made in one factory in England would fit perfectly into a bridge built by different men on a different river a year later, because there were no individual bridges. There was only the system, and the system was the same everywhere. That interchangeability sounds like a small, dry engineering virtue. It was, in fact, the beating heart of the whole invention, and it is worth understanding why. In the old way of building, a bridge was a bespoke object. It was designed for its gap, its members cut and fitted for that one crossing, and if a part was damaged or lost, you could not simply grab another, because there was no other exactly like it. Bailey turned that logic inside out. He made the part the fundamental thing, not the bridge. Once every part is identical and interchangeable, an astonishing set of consequences follows almost for free. Manufacturing becomes simple because you are making one thing over and over, not 1,000 custom pieces. Training becomes simple because a soldier who has learned to handle one panel has learned to handle every panel he will ever touch. Supply becomes simple because a truckload of panels is useful anywhere, on any river, for any bridge. And repair becomes simple because a panel wrecked by shell fire can be knocked out and replaced with the next one off the truck, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a battle. There was a further piece of quiet brilliance in how the panels were tied together. The panels formed the sides, the load-bearing girders. Across them ran steel cross-members called transoms, and on those sat the stringers and the timber decking that made the roadway. All of it, again, was standard, and all of it came in sizes a man could carry or a small team could handle. There was nothing in the entire structure that needed a crane to lift, and that single fact, more than any other, is what separated Bailey's world from the world that came before. Because it was a system of standard parts, it could be scaled without being redesigned. This was the thing the older bridges could never do. If a commander needed a bridge to carry a heavier load, or to reach across a wider gap, the engineers did not send away for a new design. They simply added more panels. They could set panels side by side to make the trusses double or triple in width. They could stack them to make the trusses double or triple in height. A light bridge and a heavy tank bridge were not two different products. They were the same panels, arranged in greater or lesser numbers, according to a set of tables the engineers carried with them. One design served from the smallest span to the largest, simply by adding steel where the load demanded it. Then there was the question of how you get a bridge across a river when you do not hold the far bank and cannot put men or cranes on the other side. Bailey's answer was as elegant as the panels themselves. The bridge was assembled entirely on the near bank and pushed out over the gap ahead of itself, rolling forward on rollers. Out in front, the engineers attached a lightweight section called the launching nose, which reached across first and rode up onto rollers on the far bank, so that the finished bridge could be pushed steadily out across empty air until it landed on the far side. No crane reaching over the water, no boats needed to float the structure, no soldier required on the enemy's bank until the roadway was already there. The bridge built itself out across the river from the safe side. And every piece of it, the panels, the pins, the transoms, the decking, the rollers, was sized to be carried in a standard army truck and handled by men on foot. The whole system was made of ordinary steel. There were no rare alloys, nothing that demanded a specialized factory. It could be manufactured by any competent engineering workshop, which meant it could be manufactured by hundreds of them at once. Look closely at what the launching method really brought, because it is easy to pass over as a clever trick, when it was in fact the difference between life and death for the men doing the work. In the old way, bridging a gap you did not control meant getting men or equipment onto the far bank somehow, by boat, by wading, by improvised raft, all of it slow and all of it done under whatever fire the enemy cared to bring down. The launching nose meant the far bank did not have to be touched until the roadway had already reached it. The whole assembly happened on the friendly side, where cover could be arranged and the work organized. And then the finished span simply rolled out over the water and set itself down on the other side. It removed the single most dangerous phase of bridge building, the exposed scramble on the enemy's shore, and replaced it with steel arriving from a safe distance. That is engineering doing the work of courage, sparing men a risk they would otherwise have had to run with their bodies. That was the design. Now it had to survive contact with a deadline that would have broken most projects. It survived. The full-scale trial the London letter had demanded took place at Christchurch, over the River Stour, on May 1, 1941. And there the reality of Bailey's system announced itself in a way no committee could argue with. The engineers put a completed 70-foot bridge across the river, and by one local account they did it in 36 minutes, and the finished span carried the weight of a lorry driven across it. A 70-foot military bridge, in a little over half an hour, built by men and rollers with no crane in sight. The old world had thought in weeks. Bailey's world thought in minutes. To prove the strength, the trials at Christchurch were deliberately brutal. In one demonstration, the engineers ran a First World War tank onto a test span, then loaded a second tank on top of it, then piled the whole thing high with pig iron until the load went past what the bridge had even been designed to carry. The bridge held. The point was made. This was not a fragile improvisation. It was a genuine heavy bridge that happened to be made of parts a man could carry. Full production was ordered within weeks. By July of 1941, factories were being set up to make it. By December, the first bridges were reaching the troops. From the reopening of a 5-year-old idea to a weapon in the hands of the army had taken, in effect, a single year. Now, it would be a lie to tell you this was the work of one lonely genius, and no one else. And this story does not need that lie. Bailey's achievement was real, and it was his, but he built on the work of others, and the honest record says so. His design drew on earlier thinking about box girder bridges from the officer named Martel, and on ideas about lattice bridges that a New Zealand-born engineer named Callender Hamilton had pursued. After the war, a royal commission that existed to reward inventors granted money to more than one of these men, recognizing that the family of ideas had more than one parent. Bailey was awarded £12,000 for his work, a very large sum in those days. Hamilton was awarded money too for his earlier contribution. Naming that does not shrink Bailey. It does the opposite. It shows that the British system, for all its faults, had a way of letting several independent minds worry at the same problem, and then of paying out honestly when the accounting was done. If any of this matters to you, if there is someone in your family who served in the Royal Engineers, or who worked in one of the hundreds of British workshops that turned out these panels, I would be glad to hear their name in the comments. The whole point of this account is that such people should not be forgotten, and a single name in a comment keeps a memory alive longer than you would think. To turn Bailey's kit of parts into a weapon of war, the army needed the men who would actually build it, and it needed them in great numbers, trained to a standard that let them assemble a heavy bridge in the dark, in the cold, in the current, and under the guns of an enemy who very much did not want that bridge to exist. Those men were the Royal Engineers, and the soldiers of the wider Commonwealth armies who worked alongside them, and to the rest of the army they were known simply as the sappers. The word bridge makes people picture something peaceful. For a combat engineer, it was one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire army, and it is worth being clear-eyed about why. An army does not build a bridge in a quiet place. It builds a bridge exactly where it most needs to cross, which is exactly where the enemy is most determined to stop it. The bridging site is chosen by the tactical situation, not by the engineer's comfort. It is, almost by definition, within range of the enemy's guns. And the men building it cannot shoot back and build at the same time. They stand in the open, on the water, hauling steel, while the fighting goes on around them. As one modern history of these units put it plainly, because the engineers were building the very means by which the army would advance, they were shot at, and shot at often. The training reflected the seriousness of it. The system was designed so that ordinary soldiers, well drilled, could build it fast. But fast and safe under fire is a skill that comes only from endless repetition. Detachments practiced the drill until every man knew his job in the dark. Who carried which panel? Who set which pin? How the bridge grew out over the gap, panel by panel, transom by transom, until the launching nose touched down on the far side and the roadway followed it across. They practiced until they could do it without thinking, because on the night that mattered, there would be no time to think. There is a particular kind of courage in this work that does not get talked about much, because it does not look like the courage of the man who charges a position with a rifle. It is the courage of concentration under fire. To assemble a bridge correctly, a man has to think clearly. He has to line up holes and drive pins and check that the structure is true, and do all of it while shells fall and bullets crack overhead and friends are hit around him. The soldier attacking a position at least has the release of movement, of shooting back. The bridge builder has none of that. He has to stand still and do careful, precise, technical work and simply absorb the fear, because the moment he stops working, the whole advance stops with him. It is a strange, patient, unglamorous bravery, and the men who had it are among the least celebrated of the war. And the bridge, for all its brilliance, only worked because those men existed to build it. A kit of standard parts is just a pile of steel until trained hands assemble it, correctly and fast, in the worst conditions imaginable. The design and the men were two halves of one machine. Bailey supplied the first half from a drawing office in southern England. The sappers supplied the second half at every river between Sicily and the Rhine. Now step back and widen the view, because there is a deeper question hiding underneath this story, and it is the most interesting one of all. The question is not simply how Britain built this bridge. The question is why it was Britain that built it, and why a professional, disciplined, technically superb army like the German army did not, and to a large extent could not. The Germans were not poor engineers. That idea is nonsense, and this story does not rest on it. The German war machine produced some of the most sophisticated engineering of the century. It built rockets that reached the edge of space. It built tanks and jet aircraft and submarines that were, in pure technical terms, extraordinary. When we ask why Germany did not produce the Bailey Bridge, we are not asking why German engineers were inferior. They were not. We are asking a subtler and more important question about how a country organizes the making of new things. Consider what the Germans actually had for panel bridging, because they did have something, and the comparison is exact and devastating. Their equivalent panel bridge was known as the Light Z Bridge. Set it beside the Bailey, and the differences tell the whole story. The German panel weighed around 1,700 pounds, roughly 3 times the weight of a Bailey panel, which meant it could not simply be picked up and carried into place by a handful of men. Where the Bailey panels were joined by pins hammered through holes, the German panels were bolted together, slower to assemble and slower to take apart. And crucially, the German design could be built in only a single configuration. You could not stack it and widen it freely the way you could a Bailey, adding strength wherever the load demanded. It came in one form. The Bailey came in as many forms as arithmetic allowed. An American engineer who examined both after the war concluded that the German design lacked practically every distinctive feature that made the Bailey what it was. Why the difference? It was not a difference of skill, it was a difference of system, and this is the heart of the whole account. German military development was hierarchical and specification-driven. It ran from the top down, through the army's own structures, catalogued and coded and issued to units according to doctrine. It was superb at refining a known solution. It was poorly suited to taking a strange idea from an unranked civilian and rushing it to the top. In that system, the German engineer who might have sketched a better bridge, if he existed, and he very well may have, would not easily have got the meeting. His idea would have met the same wall Bailey's idea met in 1936, the wall of the preferred existing answer, and in the German system there was far less chance of anyone carrying it back over that wall. Britain had something different, and it is worth naming precisely, because it sounds like a weakness, and was in fact a strength. Britain had a long, eccentric tradition of the gifted amateur and the unattached expert, the individual working slightly outside the formal structures, tolerated, and sometimes even cultivated. There was a word that came into wide use during the war for exactly this kind of person: the boffin, the civilian scientist or engineer attached to the war effort, often odd, often awkward, and working at the seam between pure knowledge and practical use. The radar scientists were boffins, the codebreakers were boffins, and Donald Bailey, the quiet civil servant with a childhood love of model bridges and an idea that had waited 5 years for its moment, was a boffin of the first order. The tradition ran deep in British life, deeper than the war, deeper than the army. It was there in the country parson who spent his evenings classifying beetles and ended up contributing something real to natural history. It was there in the amateur astronomers, the tinkerers, the retired men with sheds full of half-finished machines, the whole national habit of the private individual chasing a private obsession simply because it interested him. Most of it, of course, came to nothing, as most obsessions do. But a country that produces 10,000 harmless eccentrics also, now and then, produces the one whose obsession turns out to matter enormously. And the same loose, tolerant, slightly disorganized culture that made room for the 10,000 is what left room for the one. You cannot easily have the second without the first. A society tidy enough to weed out all the pointless tinkerers tends to weed out the priceless one along with them. That is the uncomfortable truth hiding inside this comparison, and it is worth saying carefully, so it is not mistaken for flag-waving. The German weakness here was not a lack of genius. It was, if anything, an excess of order. A system that is efficient, hierarchical, and sure of its own doctrine is a system very good at executing and very bad at surprising itself. It knows what it is looking for, and so it tends to find only that. The British muddle, by contrast, was inefficient in 100 visible ways, but it carried one hidden advantage. It did not always know what it was looking for, and so it occasionally stumbled onto something it had not thought to want. Bailey's Bridge was exactly such a thing. Nobody had ordered it, nobody had specified it. It arrived from the side, out of the head of a man the system had already turned down once, and the system had just enough given it to let the second attempt through. That is the deeper machine underneath this story. Not steel, structure. The way a society decides whose ideas get heard. By the middle of the war, that decision was paying off across 3 continents. The bridge went everywhere the British and Commonwealth and American armies went, and it changed the tempo of the war in a way that is easy to state and hard to overstate. An army that used to halt at every river now barely paused at them. The enemy's oldest defensive trick, blowing the bridges as he fell back, stopped working, because the pursuers simply built new bridges faster than anyone had believed possible, often on the very piers the retreating engineers had left standing. The first great proving ground was the Mediterranean, and then the campaign that would fix the Baileys' reputation forever, the long, grinding fight up the mountainous spine of Italy. Italy was a country made for defence, and made, it turned out, for the Bailey Bridge. It was a landscape of rivers and gorges and deep valleys, crossed by countless bridges, every one of which the retreating Germans destroyed with real skill. An army without rapid bridging would have died 1,000 small deaths in that terrain, stopped at every ravine. Instead, the sappers followed the advance with truckloads of steel panels, and the bridges went back up, again and again and again. Over the course of the Italian campaign, engineers erected thousands of these bridges. The total length of Bailey bridging built in Italy ran into the tens of miles. It became so routine that soldiers stopped remarking on it, which is its own kind of tribute. One episode from the fighting in Sicily, just before the mainland, shows what these men did and the price they paid. In July of 1943, At a place called Leonforte, Canadian engineers faced a hard tactical problem. Their infantry had fought into the town, across a deep ravine, and then found themselves cut off, with the enemy between them and their own lines, and no way to get tanks or supplies forward. The answer was a bridge, and it had to go across that ravine, and it had to go in the dark, because in daylight the crossing was swept by fire. So the engineers built it at night, across a gap of around 50 feet, under mortar and machine gun fire, and they finished it in a matter of hours. Through it went the tanks, and the relief that saved the men in the town. The soldiers afterward described the fire they had worked under, with the dark humour of men who had lived through it, as merely slightly high. An officer won a high decoration for the covering action that night. He was killed later in the war. That was the pattern, repeated in 100 places, whose names never made the newspapers. A gap, a night, a bridge. And men who did not all come home. It is one thing to read that a bridge can be built in a few hours. It is another to picture those hours, spent standing on open ground by a river in the dark, hauling half-ton steel panels into place by hand, while an enemy who knows exactly what you are doing tries to kill you before you finish. That was what the speed was made of. It was not magic. It was nerve. And then there was the Sangro, the flooded river where this account began. The Eighth Army had to force a crossing of a river swollen by 11 days of rain, against Germans holding the high ground on the far side. This was the enemy's winter line, a position chosen with care, and the river in front of it was doing the defenders' work for them. Rain had turned the Sangro from a wadable trickle into a fast brown torrent. It rose and fell with the weather, and every time it rose it threatened to tear away anything the engineers had managed to put across it. The engineers went to the ruined main crossing, where the enemy had dropped 19 spans into the water, but left the old stone piers standing. And they used those very piers as the supports for a new bridge. There is a grim irony there worth noticing. The Germans had blown the bridge to deny the crossing, and in blowing it, they had left behind the very piers that let the British rebuild so fast. Demolition assumes that rebuilding is slow. Against the Bailey, that assumption failed, and the enemy's own ruined bridge became the foundation of the bridge that undid him. On those piers, the engineers launched an enormous Bailey, well over 1,000 feet of it, pushing it out across the flood. It did not go smoothly. War rarely does. Flooding swept away some of the early bridging, and the crossing had to be fought for more than once, with men working in freezing water to rebuild what the river had taken, while the battle for the heights went on above them. But the bridges went back, and when they held, the tanks crossed, and the German line on the heights was turned. The rule the profession had lived by, that such a bridge across such a gap was weeks of work, had quietly ceased to be true. After the landings in France in 1944, the same story played out across northwestern Europe on an even larger scale. The Bailey became the principal tactical bridge of the Allied advance. As the armies broke out and raced across France and Belgium and into the Low Countries, the bridges followed at a pace that kept the pursuit from ever quite losing its grip. Hundreds upon hundreds of them went up across the rivers and canals of Europe. Wherever the map showed water, the sappers showed steel. It is worth pausing on how completely this inverted the logic of retreat. A retreating army destroys bridges precisely to buy time, to open a gap between itself and its pursuers that cannot quickly be closed. That is the oldest arithmetic of a fighting withdrawal. Blow the bridge, and the enemy must stop, reconnoitre, bring up his bridging, and build, and while he does all that you are getting away, against an army equipped with the Bailey and the trained men to use it, that arithmetic broke down. The gap the demolition was meant to open was closed almost as fast as it appeared. The pursuers arrived at the blown crossing, unloaded their panels, and were across sometimes within hours, still snapping at the heels of the men who had just destroyed the bridge to escape them. A tool of defence had been quietly turned into a tool of relentless pursuit, and the German army, falling back across the rivers of Europe, felt the difference at every one of them. The Bailey played its part too, in the great gamble of the airborne operation in the Netherlands in September of 1944, the drive to seize a corridor of bridges leading to the Rhine. When German attacks and demolitions threatened the vital crossings at Nijmegen, it was a British Bailey bridge that helped keep the road bridge in use after the enemy had struck at it. The operation as a whole fell short of its furthest goal. But even in a battle that did not fully succeed, The ability to repair and replace bridges under pressure was part of what kept the effort alive at all. And then, in the spring of 1945, came the last Great Barrier, the river that had guarded Germany from the west for as long as there had been a Germany, the Rhine. The Rhine was not just another crossing. It was wide, it was fast, and it carried an enormous weight of meaning. For the German defender, it was the moat of the homeland. For the Allied soldier, it was the last great obstacle between him and the end. Everyone on both sides understood that forcing the Rhine was the beginning of the end of the war in the West, and the engineering thrown at it reflected that understanding. The assault crossing of the Rhine in March of 1945 was one of the largest engineering undertakings of the entire war. It was not a matter of a single bridge. It was a whole system of crossings, thrown across one of the great rivers of Europe in the teeth of the enemy, by tens of thousands of engineers working together. British and Canadian engineers and pioneers were concentrated in their tens of thousands for the crossing, and American engineers in their tens of thousands more. Whole formations of men whose only job was to get the army across the water. They built pontoon bridges and Bailey bridges and every combination the system allowed, and they gave them the names of London landmarks, so that the roads to victory ran across the Rhine, over bridges called Lambeth and London and Westminster. There is something quietly moving in that choice of names. Men far from home, building under fire on a German river, naming their bridges after the bridges of the city they were fighting to protect. The largest of them showed just how far Bailey's idea of adding panels until the arithmetic was satisfied could be pushed. At the town of Rhys, Canadian engineers built a floating Bailey bridge across the Rhine that stretched, with its approaches, well over 1,700 feet, the longest of its kind built during the war to that point. They gave it a London name too. They called it Blackfriars. Men who had grown up on a quiet river in Dorset, where the first 70-foot span went across in 36 minutes, had lived to see the same system reach most of a third of a mile across the Rhine, into the heart of Germany, carrying an army toward the end of the war. Along that river, the danger never left the work. Building under the enemy's fire on the Rhine, engineers were hit. On one bridge, a single German shell killed an officer, wounded several men, and destroyed 7 of the pontoons holding the roadway on the water. The bridge got built anyway. They always got built. That was the terrible, quiet arithmetic of the sappers. The bridge is worth more than any single man who builds it, and the men who build it know that, and they build it anyway. When the accounting was done, the numbers behind the Bailey Bridge were staggering, and they are worth stating carefully, because this is a subject where myths have grown up, and the real figures are impressive enough without them. Over the course of the war, more than 600 British firms were involved in manufacturing Bailey bridging. Stop and consider what that number alone reveals. 600 firms could all make the same bridge, because the bridge had been designed, from the very start, to be made of simple standard parts, in ordinary steel, by any competent workshop. That was not an accident of production. It was built into the design. Bailey had made a bridge that the whole dispersed engineering industry of a nation could turn out in parallel, in small workshops and large, all of them producing pieces that would fit together perfectly, no matter who had made them. Between them, those firms produced on the order of 700,000 panels, amounting to something like 500,000 tons of bridging, enough, laid end to end, to make around 200 miles of bridge. At the peak, factories were turning out around 25,000 panels every month. In the Italian campaign alone, engineers built at least 2,500 Bailey bridges, and roughly 2,000 more were built in the other theatres of the war. The total number thrown across the rivers and gaps of the world in those years ran to somewhere above 4,500. You will sometimes see wilder numbers than these, and it is worth correcting one of them, because getting it right actually strengthens the story. You will occasionally read that hundreds of thousands of Bailey bridges were built. That is a confusion, almost certainly a garbling of the panel count with the bridge count. The number of individual panels ran into the hundreds of thousands. The number of complete bridges ran into the low thousands. Both figures are astonishing. Neither needs to be inflated. As for speed, the figure that best captures it comes from a wartime report which stated that, under good conditions, a team of just over 100 engineers could build a 5-span Bailey bridge in 32 minutes flat. Set that beside the old world where a heavy fixed bridge was a matter of days or weeks, and you can begin to feel the size of the change. A whole category of military problem, the river as a barrier, had quietly been dissolved. The verdict on all of this did not come only from the men who built the bridges. It came from the very top of the Allied command, and it was unambiguous. Field Marshal Montgomery, who commanded the armies that used the Bailey in Italy and then in northwestern Europe, wrote after the war that Bailey bridging had made an immense contribution to ending the conflict. He said flatly that, as far as his own operations were concerned, with the 8th Army in Italy and with his army group in northwestern Europe, he could never have maintained the speed and momentum of his advance without large supplies of Bailey bridging. During the war, he had put it more simply still, calling it quite the best thing in its line the army had ever had. It is often said, too, that the Bailey was ranked among the handful of engineering developments most responsible for the Allied victory, alongside such things as radar. That particular ranking is widely repeated and harder to pin to a single document, so take it as the judgment of history rather than a signed quotation. But Montgomery's own words are on the record, and they are as strong an endorsement as any piece of equipment in the war ever received. So we come back to the question we started with. Why could the German army, for all its brilliance, not simply match a bridge? The answer is not that the Germans were foolish. Their bridges were real, their engineers were skilled, and their soldiers, who defended those rivers, were brave and professional and did their duty. The answer is not about the quality of mines, it is about the shape of the systems those mines worked inside. The Germans had a doctrine that was complete and correct against every problem it had imagined. It had imagined the pontoon and the trestle and the improvised span. It had not imagined a kit of identical steel panels, light enough to carry by hand, strong enough to hold a tank, endless enough to reach across the Rhine, dreamed up by a civilian and rushed from a drawing office to the front in a single year. Their system could do known things superbly. It could not easily do the unforeseen thing, because it had no comfortable place for the unforeseen man. Britain, almost by accident, did. It had a culture with just enough room in it for the outsider, just enough tolerance for the awkward amateur, just enough slack in its structures that a rejected idea could sit in a drawer and be pulled out again when the moment came. That slack was not efficiency. In peacetime it often looked like waste and muddle, but in one war, at one moment, it meant that when the tanks grew too heavy and the rivers too many, the answer already existed, in the head of a quiet man from Yorkshire who had loved building model bridges as a boy and who had never quite stopped. Donald Bailey was knighted after the war, in 1946, for what he had given his country. He went on to a long and respected career in engineering education, and he lived until 1985. He remained, to the end and by every account, the same modest man he had always been. The prototype of his bridge still stands over a quiet channel of water near Christchurch, where the whole thing began, and carrying nothing more dramatic now than the occasional walker, a small grey monument to an idea that helped carry armies across a continent. The men who built his bridges deserve the last word, because they paid for the speed in a currency the drawings never showed. They were the sappers, the Royal Engineers and their Commonwealth and American counterparts, the men who stood in the cold water and the enemy's fire and hammered the pins home while the war went on around them. They won few medals for most of it. They built the road and the army crossed over them to victory, and then they packed up the trucks and drove to the next river and did it again. If your father or grandfather or great-uncle was one of them, if he was a Royal Engineer or worked in one of the hundreds of factories that made the panels, tell me his name below. That is how the memory survives, not in the tonnage, not in the mileage, not even in the bridges themselves, most of which are long gone. It survives in the names and in the telling and in the small act of one person deciding that a quiet man's good idea and the brave men who carried it across the rivers of the world should not be allowed to disappear. The rule had always been that a river was where an army stopped. One awkward outsider, and the men who trusted his design enough to build it under fire, quietly rewrote that rule. And that, in the end, is the whole story of how a country thinks, and of what it can build when it leaves a little room for the person nobody was listening to.